80 odd people boots, which fills me with joy, and people from lots of different places that always cheers me up. Our speaker tonight is Martin Rickard, which is why you've all booked in and you're all wishing that I'd shut up so he could talk.
Hi, guys.
You know, when I've got a minute. Well, so I met Martin quite a lot of years ago down at Anglesey, where he goes regularly. And we have a mutual close friend in Nigel, who gave the first of the talks in this series. And later, Nigel and I joined Martin on some fantastic trips up in Shetland that I would really recommend that people try and get to. And I'm sure that after these pictures, those of you who haven't been to Greenland will be wanting to go as soon as you can. Any questions that people have, if they can hold on till the end, if there's time, we will try and ensure that they can be answered. Martin's delivering this from Shetland, which is a wonderful place to be, a wonderful place to go. One of its wonders is that it's not got the best phone signal or the best Wi-Fi signals, so you can get away from other things in the world, which might mean that the Wi-Fi goes down. If it does, we'll give it a chance to re-establish, and Paul will work on that. If we have to stop the talk because the internet goes down, we will reconvene and sort it out again for the future. It's just, you know, on the one hand, it's a miracle that we can do it at all. On the other hand, we have to be prepared that miracles don't always work. What we'd like you to do is for everybody to be on silent, on mute, including myself. But just in case things do get closed down, it's just putting a bit of an advert out for the next talk, which will be the Leslie twins on their circumnavigation of Great Britain. If you call them the Leslie twins, it'll really annoy them, but it will cheer me up no end. So if you can look forward to that, that'll be released very soon for a talk in January. And Martin's great friends with the Leslie twins as well. Are we all okay for us to start? Over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, give this a whirl. Put a few extra 50p's in the meter, so hopefully we'll be okay up here. So my obsession with Greenland really started back in the very early 1980s. I was working in a centre with Nigel in the Peak District, and one of the things we used to do was take scallywags from the probation service down the River Wye, which is a fantastic trip unless you do it 30 times a year, and it gets a bit tedious. So we'd call in at Hay, a very famous area for secondhand books, rather than spend the evening constantly having to chat to the youngsters. Nigel bought it, I think, and I ended up with it. Gina Watkins' Last Expedition. And just reading this got me hooked on Greenland. And really, I never dreamt I'd get out there. Not until I didn't get out there until 2000. The millennium. It was a millennium expedition in 2000. The school group that I went out with. Anyway, I'll tell you a bit more about that in due course. So you all know where Greenland is, obviously. Here I am in Shetland. For me and most of the folk who come out on my trips, we fly from Glasgow or Edinburgh. More and more people are now coming from all over the globe, really. I've had folk from Tasmania, America, Norway, Sicily. So we tend to sort of travel through Reykjavik, and then we're flying out to this area of Greenland, the Amaslik area. It's quite interesting because Greenland is, I think, 10 times the size of Great Britain. The total population of Greenland is approximately 56,000 people, which I looked up, but it's the same as Manchester United, it's Old Trafford, isn't it, Manchester United? It's the same as their football ground on a Saturday before COVID. They would have, I think, 75,000 people in Old Trafford. So if you think of that, that's the whole population, more than the whole population of Greenland in Old Trafford on a Saturday. In perspective. The area I particularly am interested in working in, as I said, is the Sealak. Sealak is an island, a Maslik island. We fly in from Iceland to a settlement here called Kulasug. And this area is just a snip from a satellite image, but the Kommuna, the Greenlandic Council, if you like, it's called the Kommuna, they administer an area the size of Great Britain. And in that area the size of Great Britain, it has a population of about 3,500 people. So once we get on trip, we're pretty much alone. Sealak here is the main settlement on the east coast of Greenland. There's another one further north called Itokotormi. It's about 700 miles north. And you can see there's 5 little tiny villages, settlements around Sealak, which that all adds up to a total population for the east coast of Greenland, and certainly for this area, about 3,500 people. This is a satellite image. I tend to start gearing up in sort of May, June, looking at conditions, trying to work out what it's going to be like for the summer, where we're going to go. And it's pretty important to get as much information, obviously, as you can beforehand. So this is all pack ice coming down the east coast. This is winter ice, so it's frozen up in the winter. Pack ice that's frozen up, it's not broken away, it's still attached to the land, and obviously it makes passageways like this impassable. So we're looking well in advance to see exactly what conditions are likely to be like for us. But here you can see icebergs, individual icebergs that have broken away from the Greenland, either the Greenland ice cap where it carves into the sea, or there'll be big rafts of sea ice that are still in one big lump. And we were paddling around some the other year that were over 1 kilometre long. So anyway, the pictures you're going to see first off, I've actually got 5 chapters, if you like, 5 folders to share with you. The first one is just generally about guiding and a bit of info about the communities, which I find fascinating. It's not all about paddling, it's the people you meet, the people you're going with, and those shared experiences really that make it such an experience for me anyway. Food is pretty scarce and hard to come by in Greenland for us, certainly in the quantities and varieties that we want on expedition. You can buy a gun, you can buy chicken wire, you can get dehydrated rice and stuff like that. Jim's a bit perplexed here. I don't know what he went in for, but he hasn't found it. This is Jimsky. No, Jimsky. Jim's helped me on lots of trips. We do tend to take our own food in. You could provision a trip from here if you weren't a fussy eater. Again, you can buy a gun, you can buy bras, you can buy fishing tackle, but food's a bit hard to come by. A lot of people say to me, there's no polar bears in the summer in Greenland, East Greenland that is. I don't think there are any on the west coast. It's amazing the number that you reported while you're there, even though the tourist office says no, there's no polar bears in this area of Greenland. Consequently, what we do on trip is a night watch. We started off in the early days not doing anything other than carrying a gun. Then we started setting trip wires up, and but now we do a waking watch, so someone takes it in turn to do a shift. The community is quite poor. East Greenland is really like sort of the poor relation of Greenland in general. They get to some extent what's left over. They're always fighting for equality with West Greenland, but I think Greenland would quite happily close down East Greenland, house everybody on the west coast. It would save an absolute fortune, but obviously socially they can't do that. A lot of people rely on crafts, and you can see a guy here, Tobias. He's making some. There's not a lot of tourists really where we are. It's not a touristy area, but they do make stuff out of ivory, narwhal tusk, polar bear bones, and things like that to sell to visitors who come in. So there's a small workshop in Maslik or Sealak, same place. They're making stuff really to order, And unfortunately, as soon as they get a bit of cash, they're off down the shop and buying beer. A lot of people quite heavily affected by alcohol in Greenland. You can't buy spirits in Greenland, for example. Greenland government made that illegal because of the devastating effect it had on a lot of people. This guy's name eludes me at the moment, but he's a traditional drum dancer, very proud of his ancestry. They all are anyway, but this guy's ancestors date back to the days of shaman, medicine man, if you like, in the community. So he'll do a drum dance to any visitors. Quite a character. Subsistence hunting is a big part of the economy in this area. You have families that are designated just as hunters, so they don't get any handouts from the government, or if they do, it's at a reduced amount. So they're really forced to go and hunt. Nothing's wasted. A lot of the people who come with me initially think, oh, how terrible, poor seals, poor whales, poor bears. And you can understand that, but nothing's wasted. They don't have cattle or sheep or anything like that in this area, unlike the west coast and the south coast of Greenland, where there's sheep and goats and they can grow crops. Everything here comes from the sea and what the sea has to for them to hunt. Skins aren't really used anymore, but all the work, this is seal skin hanging up on drying racks. This will dry and become a beef jerky type meal. So there's a washing line here with clothes on, and then just underneath you've got fish drying, steaks drying. Housing's, it's either very good or very poor. There's a lot of people with amazing amount of money in Greenland. I don't know where they get it from. Not an amazing amount compared to us, but they can afford expensive boats. There's very few cars in Greenland, very few roads. And then there's obviously people with an awful lot less. Most of the property, even now in the main settlement of Tasiilaq, has bucket toilets. And this is the chocolate lorry. So basically this is quite a prestigious job. You're working for the council. There's a driver and a bucket man. So the driver's got the best job, obviously. And then basically the bucket man jumps out, wanders down to your front door. Inside your front door, there's a cupboard. And in the cupboard, there's a bucket brimming with horridness. And he just basically puts it on his shoulder and tips it in this lorry and goes around the community, emptying everybody's bucket. And unfortunately, this then just gets pumped into the sea. It gets mulched up, but it basically goes into the sea. So the cod in the fjord of Tasiilaq is very large, but I wouldn't want to eat it. Some of the more modern houses have a huge, big stainless steel holding tank in their basement that would hold thousands of gallons of dirty water. But they're the more modern ones, and they're just pumped out. Same idea. So there's quite a few just general shots that I'm not going to talk over, just to give you a flavour. This is a group of, we've arrived. I've got several containers out there with kit in. I store it all year round and keep acquiring more stuff as the years go on. But we just gear up basically. Well, the first group that come out, we gear up in Tasiilaq, and then we tend to do a linear trip, start here, finish somewhere else. Next group will come out, they'll start wherever somewhere else was and finish somewhere else. And then eventually as the summer goes, we hopefully end up back here so we can put all the kit away. This was quite a funny story. The guy with little hair is Dave. Some of you may know Dave. He was a police officer at the time, so he thought it was quite a chuckle to be caught on camera sawing off a shotgun to make it a bank robber's gun and illegal. And the other guy is a guy called Ian Curfey, who was the last man in the Antarctic to drive dog teams. So he was quite a character. We met in Shetland, and he started telling me out of the blue about his hero, Gino Watkins. Listened to him for an hour or so, and then said, "Do you want a place on a trip next year?" So Ian came out on that. So here we are. We're on trip, which is random pictures really. This is ideal conditions for us. enough ice so that you winded your way through. It's quite important for us to have ice in the sea and to be pack ice out to sea, because that keeps the swell down. We don't want sort of water like you'd expect in this country or Scotland or anywhere else, because most of the coast is very inhospitable, difficult to land on, few landings anyway. And if there's a swell running, you're really in a very committing area. Some of you recognize Sam here. Sam's been out. I met Sam back in, well, when was it? 83, when Nigel ran a trip to the west coast of Ireland. I went out with a mate because we were paddling around. The idea was to paddle around Ireland. So I think Nigel got assessed for some guiding qualification at the time, and I was on the trip and got assessed from a 5-star or something. Can't remember now. So I've known Sam since then, and he's been out several times with me. So he still prefers to paddle a boat without a skeg. So this is a little bit more extreme ice. We've stopped here. Well, we were forced to stop here basically and climb out. The water was disappearing fast. Obviously, these pictures don't give you the impression that the ice is moving at all, which it obviously is, and it can move very fast indeed at times. So we've basically climbed out here just to assess it, get a bit of height to see where there might be some open water. And I think we spent, well, Pete, you were on this trip, I think. I think we were contemplating spending the night on this rock at the time. But we made it a bit further afield. Quite an impressive lump of ice. It's amazing to think there's 8 times this under the water. We're not quite as close as the picture would indicate. Admittedly, in hindsight and years of running trips now, we are too close. We're certainly not as close as we look. And I think about half an hour, I was really chuffed with this trip because that's my son. I was really pleased he came on this trip. And between various years at university, he sneaked away. So just, yeah, some nice pictures. These guys were from, this is Jeff Murray, good friend now. He came out with Greg. They were from Tasmania. Jeff's been back many times and paddled up to Lakefield with me on the Watkins missions. This is about 3 in the morning. Water was frozen. We tend to paddle sort of realistic times. People are on holiday, they'd call it an expedition, but it is their annual leave. So left a busy job, most of them, and something that's exciting and a trip of a lifetime, but we don't paddle unreasonable hours. This was, having said that, this was 3 in the morning because we were trying to get somewhere before the wind came in. You can't paddle in ice when it's windy for obvious reasons. It tends to have an undesirable effect on your kayak. And if it's very rough too, wades with solid lumps of ice floating around in don't really go hand in hand with fiberglass. So this is just a classic picture. June, July, beginning of August, the sun doesn't set. We've got 24 hours daylight. It's quite impressive. Makes bear watch very easy, quite enjoyable, in fact. It's a great opportunity. As the season goes on, it tends to get a bit darker. Any opportunity we can. We're not looking for whales here. We've climbed up onto a bit of a hill. It's actually a turf house, an old settlement that I'm leaning on. And we're just looking through the binoculars to try and see if there's a way along the coast through the ice where there's an area that we know is a bit of a pinch neck. So I alluded to the fact that I went out in 2000 on a schools expedition. I went out as a mountaineering instructor on that trip. Pete Jones happened to be on it as the kayak coach and helping a guy called Gareth Burnell run this trip. And I'd got this idea that I wanted to paddle in Greenland. I'd read that book I showed you umpteen times. Nigel had just come back from Easter Island or somewhere exotic, and he'd made his first 3-piece Explorer. I phoned him up and said, Nigel, could I borrow that 3-piece because I want to go to Greenland, and I'm going to be on my own, so I need a 3-piece boat. And Nigel apparently, well, it turned out Nigel had just sold, I think, a dozen of these boats to this public school, Bishop Stortford College. So after a bit of a chat, I phoned up Gareth, and after an hour or so on the phone, he decided that I would be useful to me on his trip. I didn't need to borrow Nigel's 3-piece. we were able to use these. And I stayed on after that trip and did a personal trip on my own using these boats. Until recently, they were still there. That was in 2000, so it's 20 years ago. They've died, obviously, over the years. Pete and I would go out every year for a few years, sort of borrowing them and then repairing them afterwards, using them as a resource to do personal trips, but still spending a bit of time with the community, training up some of the local kayakers, a bit like Coles to Newcastle, teaching Greenlandic people how to kayak and roll. But it was very successful for quite a number of years. The boats eventually have died though. But it was intriguing to see how they'd rigged all up, you know, different deck lines, rigged them all up for hunting. So that's one of my more modern boats. I've got a variety of boats, Nigel's boats, Mike Webb's boats. Yeah. And the little kids are great. They love coming down. They're really inquisitive. You can leave anything lying around and they don't pinch it. And I think especially as we turn up in a kayak rather than any other form of transport, the locals consider us that, you know, I've been told on numerous occasions by different people, Martin, you're not tourist, you are kayaker. It's pretty cool. And you have great sort of interaction with people. This is a family. It was late in the evening. It was a Sunday. I remember that they'd gone out for like our equivalent of a Sunday drive, and they were just finishing up their fishing. Family of 6 in a boat that I wouldn't really want to even use on sheltered bow in Shetland. The engine sounded like a tin can full of marbles, but they were quite happy and fascinated in the kayaks, genuinely interested, very welcoming, very helpful, great people. This is a trip a bit recently than that. This is an area called Johan Petersen Fjord. Rarely get as far as we have done here. We're right at the head of it. Just stopped for lunch basically on some fantastic rocks. We've got Barry Shaw here cooking up one of his delights. It's quite a chef on the quiet, it's Barry. And I think we've got Barry and Claire here discussing what they're going to have for tea the following day. This is an interesting area. It's an area we quite often visit. It's an old American air base left over from, well, it was running during the war, and then it sort of, it's the Cold War period. It was actually closed down in about the 1950s, I think, someone will correct me. But when I first discovered it, I was just with Pete Jones. We were paddling down the straits here, and we were way up to the right. And I could see the sun shining on what I thought was a field of poppies. It wasn't until we got closer and closer that we realized they were those 50-gallon oil drums, rusty, shining in the sun. But I actually spoke to the guy who was running this place. He had a website up back in 2001, this trip would have been, with Pete. And we were trying to get to Gino Watkins' base camp when we first discovered the airbase. And he said that, oh, did you find the safe? Did you find the airplanes? Did you find the guns and hand grenades in the safe and stuff like this? Because they'd been given 24 hours notice to abandon the site. So it is great. It's like history. It's a historic site to me. People view it as rubbish and it should be removed, but for me it's all part of it. Fascinating. Oh, we found my son, when he came out, he found a GI's American GI's helmet, which I've actually got in the garage here, I think. One year we found a Thompson submachine gun. I couldn't bring that home, obviously, but I hid it thinking, right, I'm going to show this to groups next year. But lo and behold, when I went to retrieve it, someone else had found my hiding place and had removed it. Pete and I thought we were going to make a bit of a killing because we found original Coca-Cola bottles in the dump. So we took these back and put them on eBay, and it's absolutely worthless. So just moving on, just general shots, as I say, I'll just go back one. Yeah, it's quite important. Tents, yeah, you rely on your tent, like anywhere when you go on trip, and your kit is essential, but more and more so out here. There's no rescue, there's no, well, there is, but it's who you know, really, and there's nothing official. And, it's expensive and relying on satellite phones if you had a problem. like many trips you guys do, but a bit more so than obviously paddling closer waters. I love this picture. It was drawn by someone on a trip a few years ago, and every time we got off the water, we'd be cold and wet, and we'd be putting tents up and things like this, getting stoves going. But this person would sit on a rock and get their pen and ink out and sketch. And it just really made me think that we click photos, but to produce this, they really had to look and see. And it's not like taking a photo. So I really love that picture. Yeah, just typical sort of nice sunny weather. I don't tend to take pictures when it's, I'm not very good at taking pictures. I only take pictures when it's nice and sunny. You get plenty of opportunity. You can see a variety of boats out there, different boats for different people. They're all different, so I've got a good selection of boats. I think this credit for this must go to Jeff Murray. I think he's pretty much a professional photographer now. He's been out with me quite a few times. He's from Tasmania, and he was on a recent trip to Lakefield where Gina Watkins died. A bit of a mission to get him there, and a few other people. So the water is, it's not typical, but it's not atypical. The water is often as calm as this, and even I've taken photos. Yeah, so this guy is obviously hunter fisherman. What they can get these boats through is beyond belief sometimes, and obviously even a 50, 80 horsepower engine is far more powerful than anything we can do with just 2 arms. So if these guys can get through, then it gives an indication that we might be able to, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee it. Quite often we're having to get out, excuse me, and drag boats. And I remember one trip in the early days with Pete and his family and some friends. We ended up in a situation where the water was just disappearing. The ice was coming in eddies in a channel, and I sussed it quick and said, right, everybody out. And I remember standing on a nice flat iceberg, probably 2 hours. It was going round and round in the eddy. Eventually, we all deemed it appropriate to seal launch in and paddle to shore as fast as possible. Humpback whales, fin whales, narwhal, killer whales, rats or huge big pods of Greenlandic seals. Wildlife is pretty good. Not a lot of bird life, but whales, it's plenty. Yellow tent's just a cooked tent. Another nice picture. Not a lot of tidal range really in this area. Quite good. I go for carrying boats. I put this one in because this is in Nigel's brochure. Sea Kayaking UK and Celtic Paddles. I don't give credit to myself, then don't get it. But no, it's a nice shot. And here, this is a humpback whale. A couple of years ago, or a year ago, I guess. No, obviously we weren't out there this past summer. We were in quite thick ice here, actually, big icebergs. This is a bit of a fuzzy picture taken off a video. We didn't get any stills picture of it. But this whale just came right in, up to the kayak, and then dived under the kayak and went under the ice. Incredible, being so close. Oh yeah, Giacomo. Some of you may know Giacomo, my Sicilian big brother or little brother. I'm not sure. Little brother, I guess, although he's younger than me. Anyway, these are Sicilian socks. You can imagine if you know Giacomo. And just here on the right, my old smelly darned Shetland socks. So that was, I always think Greenland is a country of contrasts between the people and the pollution in the detritus in the communities, and the incredible environment that you're paddling in. This was one of the trips we did. This was a trip of extremes because we had Giacomo in his Sicilian gear and me in my slightly more worn out British garb. So another encounter with locals. It's amazing where they get to in these boats. No life jackets, nothing, no radios. They're just out hunting, fishing. They'll set a lot of nets out for fish when the ice has moved on. We've got Jimsky here, life and soul of the party. Unless you've been on trip with him more than a dozen times, because he just tells the same jokes all the time, I find. So obviously Paul here hadn't heard that joke, but I had. Yeah, Jimsky is the life and soul. He's good anywhere, on the water, up a hill, or in the bar. For a better paddling mate. This was interesting. We stopped here for lunch. And we were going to camp here. We actually had got the tents up here. This is an earlier trip with Giacomo, who had set his tent up. So Paul was on that trip. We set our tents up on this rock. Have to weight them down with boulders. We'd never had any issues before whatsoever. We'd had a few carvings off this glacier snout, but nothing really that scary. Of course, the trip that Paul was on the other year, a huge bit womphed off this. I didn't see it actually do it, but the first we heard about it was that guy who had put his tent up where Giacomo is sitting now rushed down to report that the water had come up and into his tent from the wave. So we ummed and ahed and then decided the best thing was to go and find somewhere else to camp. So, I'll just go back to that. I like this picture. This is Luciano. He's from Italy. And I think it was that picture that made it to the cover of Ocean Paddler when I did an article. Luciano paddled with wings, and he was an ex-Italian mountain guide. And then he had a hip replaced when he was probably my age then, decided that he wasn't going to do any serious mountaineering. So he had these wings and he would just paddle so fast that he would paddle off, paddle around, come around behind us, overtake us and just circle us like a sheepdog most of the day. So I talked about getting up high to get a view. Often just getting out of your boat and standing on some ice is enough to get a different perspective on what the ice flow is doing. It's an opportunity to have a pee. It's an opportunity to get Jimsky with his little pressure boiler coffee pot thing out. So it's good. It's a bit of a novelty too. You know, you don't often get the opportunity to paddle mad to seal launch on and off an iceberg. This is winter ice, so this is flat ice from the winter. Few years, I've tried to build some good relationships with the community. This was a group that I spent a lot of, I think, 10 days with in 2006, maybe 2010, perhaps. I can't remember now. Doesn't matter. But they were all locals. They didn't speak obviously any English. They spoke Greenlandic, which actually is a language that you can't write down. East Greenlandic. You have to learn West Greenlandic to be able to write down Greenlandic. So they knew some Danish. I had a Danish interpreter here, Susan. We ran a workshop for them to teach them, of all things, kayak rolling. And yeah, it was amazing. The only stuff they had were, going back to that, the 2000 trip that we did with that school group, one of the objects of that was to set up a kayak club at the end of it, which is pretty much what Pete and Gareth and to some extent I did. But the main credit goes to Pete Jones for that. And then we borrowed the kayaks back. But the kayaks were still there at this time, and they weren't being used. No one had any skills. So I decided at the end of one of my trips that I'd run this workshop and train them up. But they only had long john wetsuits and trainers, and then a horrible sort of cheapo kayak top, which they wore next to their skin on top. But it was like working with a group of kids. You know, you'd say, right, come on, time to go in for lunch. And oh yeah, in a minute. You couldn't get them out of the water. It was incredible. Their stamina, they couldn't swim, most of them, but their stamina for putting up with cold water was incredible. So we've got Lars here and his father, Lars. They were narwhal hunters. They've gone on subsequently. They bought a kayak off Gareth when we left that trip in 2000. And they're very active hunters. That's their boat. That's their motorboat with the kayak on top. So I was actually able to teach a Greenlandic hunter how to roll his kayak with a Greenlandic paddle. So I was quite chuffed at that. So just nice pictures, really, just to give you an idea of what I've missed out this summer. The only sort of animals on land really are foxes. They're quite common. This guy was probably they're very inquisitive. They're also a pest. Me and Pete watched one year when we were trying to get up to where Gina Watkins died, take off the front hatch cover of an NDK Greenlander, which they're quite a tight fit. And he worked away and got this hatch cover off without damaging it at all. So I put this picture in because I wanted to explain to you the early housing that they had. You can see a turf house here, Greenlandic turf house. As you paddle around the coast, your eye gets tuned into these things because it's the only area where there's any grass. And that's because they've basically taken all the sods from the surrounding area, made a sod and stone wall, and then any rubbish they throw out would have in those days been animal product rather than plastic and rubbish like we have nowadays. And it would have all fertilized the soil. So there's a turf house here. There's another turf house there. There's a turf house here, quite a large one. And over the back, there's another one. And where all the turf houses are, there's always a grave. There's like a crypt here of bones. So this would have been quite an early turf house. It would have had a roof of driftwood and bones and seal skin, animal skins, and it would have been entered through a long, narrow tunnel, a bit like an igloo. That was their entrance. And the early ones didn't have any form of windows or natural lighting. And then in more recent times, this is the time of Gina Watkins, in around the 30s, after the Danes had been going into Amazlic a while, they repurposed the roundhouses so that they could build inside them a garden shed, basically, because they thought that was, they wanted to keep up with the Danes who were beginning to build wooden houses in Amazlic and settle. So it was a case of keeping up with the neighbours, but they were nowhere near as practical as their original housing was. So you can still see that. So that's a wooden shed inside, basically an old turf house. And there's a number of these that I know of around the area. So one of the trips we're going to do next time we get out there is to connect all these huts up and do a hunter's hut trip. One advantage of going into those huts overnight is it saves you doing a bear watch. It offers scant protection from a polar bear, but psychologically, you think there's a bit of a barrier. So every campsite, there's always bones. And it was a bit off-putting, a bit weird to start with, but you get used to it. And obviously everyone respects it. And no one messes about with it. But it's quite fascinating to just see these open graves, really. And yeah, polar bears. See a lot of polar bear skins. There's a quota for polar bears. They're allowed to shoot 25 a year. After that, they're not supposed to shoot them. And they're supposed to shoot them, well, ideally, they take them before the end of the winter when they're in their prime condition. Come the summer, then they're skinny, hungry, a threat to us then. But they're not in such good condition either for meat or for the pelts. This is an essential part of their economy for the locals. And obviously, likes of me going in, we're not allowed to shoot a bear, quite rightly. And if we had to shoot a bear, God forbid, then there'd be some serious questions asked as to what we were doing and what precautions we had or hadn't taken. Oh, this is interesting. This is a boat. It's called the Maud. Some of you may have heard of it. It was a boat that belonged to Amundsen. After Amundsen did his famous trip through the Northwest Passage in that boat called Weir or whatever it was, which is now in a museum in Oslo, he then commissioned this boat, had it built, and he was going back through the Northwest Passage in this boat, trading. I think he had ideas of trading, and it ended up in Cambridge Bay, the Northwest Passage, and he ran out of money and went bankrupt. He ended up selling it to the Hudson Bay Company, Cambridge Bay, where it was used for a storeroom and a radio room, radio sort of a shack type thing, for a number of years. Eventually it sank, and it ended up on the bottom of Cambridge Bay, that some wealthy Norwegian entrepreneur tracked it down, refloated it. It's here in Tasiilaq. It had come obviously through the Northwest Passage and round Greenland, and it's now in Tasiilaq, hopping its way via Iceland to get back to Norway. So that was quite incredible. So there you are, Pete. That's the one picture of you. That's the one picture of you, James. This was the occasion, James, I think you had lost your supper. Not quite sure. I'm winding him up. So yeah, seal launching in. Fun, as long as you get it right. It'd be a bit embarrassing if the ice broke at the back of your boat and you wobbled in. Locals are very, because we're kayakers, they view us differently. As I said, this is a guy I know in a small settlement that Pete and James have been to, and he's just pointing out where they saw a bear a few weeks ago, giving us the heads up. And they're good. They won't give you any bullshit, so they'll give you good, reliable information, either on ice conditions, or perhaps if they've seen a bear. Having said that, he doesn't speak any English. I don't speak any Greenlandic. I only ever thought I'd go to Greenland once, so I just learned thank you, which is Goiana, and then I learned to recognize the response to Goiana, which is Itida, which is you're welcome. But using sign language and charade type communication, you can get by. And if you can't take time to stand and stare, then it's pretty sad. We're not looking at anything in particular. We landed on an island that I'd never even seen before, because it was always surrounded by huge icebergs. I paddled past it. I knew there was like a rock there. On this particular year, there was less ice. We were able to actually land, camping there because it was such an amazing place. And we're just standing and staring at the ice. It looks like we're watching something dramatic happening. No, it's just chill out time. Well, Paul will remember this. We were in a small community. I spied the remains of a whale in the harbour, or between us we had. And the water was too deep, so it was impossible to get any bones or any teeth off this. It was a killer whale. So when we went back, we timed our arrival on our return for low water, and then we're up to our calves in green stinking goop, fishing out all these killer whale teeth. Fortunately, he had some soap, and we found a puddle. But the stink of those bones, rotting bones, carcass lasted for days. That's the picture of you, Steve. Just for the record, prove to your family that you do come with me. Oh, this was a bit of fun. This was Jimsky's birthday. He's usually out there on his birthday, and we tend to play a trick on him. You have to. One year I remember filling his tent full of balloons. Another year I think we had a good fire going, so we unzipped his tent and filled it full of acrid smoke and zipped it up again. So we usually have a bit of a laugh on his birthday. This occasion, we'd seen this fantastic boat. It's actually fiberglass, it's not wood. We paddled over to it as we were leaving the campsite, thinking that he'd run aground. I think he had actually, but by the time we saw him, he was afloat again. We got chatting, and he was from south of coast of England somewhere. Can't remember his actual location. Anyway, we got chatting. I was telling him about Gino Watkins and said, oh, you should go up there in your boat and see where his Wakefield was and the cross and everything. We got chatting, and then I said, well, you're going our way, how about giving us a tow? So he towed us down. Well, he started towing us down this passageway that's the whole day paddle down a real long straight field. It's about a 9-hour paddle from one end to the other. Although it's a fantastic view, it's the same view for 9 hours. I call it the Larry Grew. Anyway, so once they realized it was Jimsky's birthday, you can see in his hand, he's got a mug of tea, China mug of tea. So they gave us all mugs of tea, and they found us a cake, cut it up, put candles in it, and the whole crew, I think it was 4 or 5 of them, sang happy birthday to Jim. So it was great. So we had a ride for a little while, and then we were actually going faster than they were sailing. So we paddled off and left them. One of Jim's many talents, I said he's good on the hill, good on the sea, good in the bar. One of his many talents is getting one of these huge, big plastic spoons in his mouth and actually closing his mouth properly without choking. Not a lot of firewood in Greenland now because Jim's been on lots of trips and he's a bit of a pyro. We do try and have a bonfire, or not a bonfire, a nice sensible fire. And it's also good if you're doing bear watch to have a bit of a fire going if you've got enough wood. That particular trip was a great trip because it was a great bunch. We've got Sam Cook, got the Pete's family members here and friends. So it was like a family trip almost for me. They'd all been out several times before. And I remember Ellie, Pete's daughter here, saying to me, we were sat here and she says, oh, do you ever get northern lights out here at this time of year? I said, no, don't be that here, it's just too soon. And she said, well, what's that up there? So it doesn't, my camera doesn't do it justice, but I was amazed I actually captured anything. But even in August, you could get northern lights. So that was my, that's just general guiding. Yeah, a couple of folk here from Ireland, good friends now. I'm sure they'll be coming out again. And you know, obligatory beer at the end of the trip. So that's just a bit of a slideshow on the general area. See if we can work out how to do this now. I'm making a complete mess of it. We'll be shaking his head. Right. So now, on report. Kill that. That. Okay, great. I think this is. I think we're back. So we're back on the Gino. Everything revolves for me around this book. It cost £2 to buy it, and it's cost an absolute fortune ever since. So Gino Watkins. So we were on a mission. Straight after that school trip in 2000, I was on a mission to get to a place called Lakefield where Gino Watkins died. Just seemed an obvious thing to do, having had that book. So we've got a Maslick Island here. This is Tasiilaq. To get to Lakefield, you basically need to paddle up here. It's about 180 miles to Lakefield there. And then, of course, you have to back again safely. So this is the starting off point, really. We're starting the trip. The slides are starting from here. This is the area I've shown you pictures of the guiding in. We're now starting from this little settlement here, Samiligar, and we're next set of pictures take us up to Lakefield. And I suppose, to be honest, it was a trip that me and Pete put together originally in 2001, 2002, because we thought, well, in those days it wasn't easy, but you could get a bit of financial support to do stuff like this, get a free holiday. So, you know, set off on that mission, got a trip paid for us in 2001 or 2002. We didn't get there. We went back again the following year because I got a bit more money to help, and we found it that year. But since then, I've been back four 4 or 5 times. It's a tremendous trip, pretty committing, so I don't do it that often. But this is just a fantastic campsite starting off. There's only 4 of us on this trip. I think it was 4. Pretty difficult to do a bear watch when there's just 4 of you. So this is John Paschke from Glasgow and other parts. He's setting up a trip line. So if a polar bear came, it would set off this line, in theory, that would wake us up so we could scare the bear off. So this was a bit of a faff every night setting up that thing. With a normal group, I tend to take 8 plus guides. So we've got plenty of people to do a waking watch. So this is winter ice. It hasn't gone. You could get out and stand on it. There were actually seals coming out of holes, breathing holes, and you can just see them there maybe. So we thought, well, yes, this is definitely an area there will be bears. There's food here for them. Initially, we thought we won't be able to get across here. Inevitably, on investigation, we could paddle around the side. And then you got to fantastic open water. This is an area that James Pigden, who's a good friend now, he's been here a few times. He got ill here. He came out on a trip with me a few years back. Unfortunately, even though he'd got the green light from the hospital to come out, he got as far as this place here, Depot Island, quite a famous area mentioned in the Watkins book, a significant spot. And he was quite poorly, and we ended up having to get him as he backed out. What was interesting, well, it wasn't interesting, it was kind of a giggle afterwards because we were all quite concerned about him. But he had a load of good stuff. He had prepared a bit better than other people, so he had really good food, freeze-dried food. Some of us had like that Kraft dinner rubbish in cardboard boxes. And he'd got a very nice bottle of whiskey. And he was also paddling a fiberglass boat. So we decided, because there was a rescue hunter coming out to extract him and take him to the hospital, we thought, right, well, we don't want a fiberglass boat bouncing around. So we swapped it for one of the plastic Nord caps. And then we thought, right, what else has he got in his boat that he's not going to need, either if he dies or if he's in hospital, eating hospital food. So we just basically robbed him blind of everything that was worth having. Never let me forget it. But we'd giggle because we'd do a toast every night to him on a video from our different campsites and send them back to him when we got home. So water was pretty scarce here. We got Sam and Jim catching drips. It was late in the season and it was very dry. Normally there's enough water to not worry about melting ice or anything like that. Not all days are nice and sunny, obviously. This was a pretty foggy day. This is John Paschke. This trip was actually in, when did we do it? It was only a few years ago. This is the most recent visit I've had. And the reason I got talked into going back, I'll just run through some of these, was that in reference, having read that book, Watkins' Last Expedition, there's a lot of reference to, this is worth a caption. I'm sure it's been up for a caption before. So you can tell by Jim's face, he's just done the unthinkable in his dry suit. It's inflating. And I've obviously heard him, and my comment was, geez, Jim, or something like that. But I'm sure we can come up with a caption. So Jimsky was on that. Jimsky was on a trip. We tried to get to Lakefield. Unfortunately, we didn't get there that year. That was the year James got evacuated. So on this trip, there was myself, James, and Jeff Murray, John Paschke, Donna from America. So I forgot what I was going to say then. Anyway, so we're just paddling along. Nice weather. It's a bit of a worry, really, because there's no ice out to sea, and you need probably about 30 miles of pack ice out to sea to keep the swell down and to keep this looking like it is now, which is absolutely flat calm. Because there's no ice, we're obviously at the mercy of the weather gods and the sea gods, and this could have changed overnight, literally, if the swell came in. Landings are very few and far between. So this was another little spot I knew of. I know this route quite well now, and there's very few landings, very few opportunities to camp. So you're committed to get to certain places on certain days, which means some days are really long and some days are actually quite short. We had elected to stop here and stay in that hut, but when we got there, it was absolutely minging. I think there'd been local hunters in the winter come out here on the dog sled expedition hunting bears, and we couldn't possibly stay in that hut. So we decided that we would paddle on. So the hut was here somewhere, and we thought we would paddle on and try and find somewhere to camp along the coast here. And that would reduce the distance we had to do the next day to Lakefield. So basically, there was the Maslick. This is the area I showed you the first pictures on. This was the first campsite of this slideshow. We've paddled along here, very few opportunities to land. Prone, obviously, to the ocean swell. And what we're also quite exposed to is strong winds coming off the Greenland ice cap. So it doesn't really show it up here on the white bit of the screen. That's basically where the Greenland ice cap starts. So you get a thing even in the summer called a Peterak, which is a strong offshore wind, which can blow you out to sea without much warning. So we that hut's here. We paddled out to there looking for somewhere to camp. There wasn't anywhere, so we had to come all the way back to the next campsite. This bit of coast I paddled before, there's absolutely nowhere to land on here at all, which is hard to imagine looking at it from here. And we were then heading in. This is where we were heading to. So there's our campsite. We'd come back. Next day we were going to be paddling off here. I'll have to start talking a bit faster because I'm sticking away. Nice picture from Jeff Murray again. This is us heading off. We've got one possible landing. I think we can land over here underneath this, the final P, before heading round. And it's about a 30-mile trip around the coast without the opportunity to land. Unless, of course, you can land on the ice like you've seen us do in other pictures. But on this occasion, there was no suitable ice to land on. Just great big widow makers, as I call them, and just a very exposed bit of coast with no opportunity to land. So this is Donna from America. She'd been out on half a dozen trips with me. She was a Gina Watkins convert, and you can see us now paddling in. This is the fjord, Lake Field as it's called, Tugtalik. The local name's Tugtalik. This is where Gina Watkins died in 1931. And they reckon basically he was fishing or hunting seals under this glacier snout, and a big piece of ice came off and upset him. They think he was actually stood on a piece of ice, either adjusting his kayak or taking a shot at a seal from the ice. And obviously a wave created by the ice carving upset him and pitched him into the sea. And they reckon that his boat just drifted off, gently drifted away from where he was. And he decided to swim for his boat because he was on his own, the intention of dragging it back to the ice that he was on and sorting himself out. But the water's so cold, he never made it back. Interestingly enough, when I came back from that schools expedition in 2000 with Gareth, it was Bishop Stortford College, and they said, "Oh, we're going to have a returning expedition black tie dinner. You're welcome." So I went down to it. I remember me and Pete stopping and getting suits from Oxfam or somewhere to turn up for this dinner, and we thought, "Oh, it'll be fantastic, this meal." And obviously, you know, public school. I never went to public school, but this school was like Hogwarts. It really was. We sat in the main hall, and I actually made sure I sat next to Richard Watkins, who was one of Gino's, I think it was Gino Watkins' nephew. Anyway, it was great. I got to fondle Gino's medals and talk to Richard and see the private family photo album. And he was really quite impressed in what we were trying to do and how much we knew about Gino Watkins. And he actually underwrote the trip that me and Pete eventually got here, originally in 2002, I think it was. So that's the view looking from Watkins Cross back out of Tugtalick or Lakefield. This island's called Ailsa Island, after Ailsa Craig. This is a replaced cross. It was done in 1967. Oxford University went into the area. That's the original, featured in 1931. I think it was Oxford University went in boats. They didn't kayak in. They had quite a big scientific trip, geography, field study trip. They went in 67. And then this cross was put in place then. When me and Pete originally came out here, it had got knocked over in a winter storm, avalanche or something like that, and bowled it over and bent it. So we repositioned it, and it was nice to see. Every year I've been back, well, not every year, but every occasion I've been back, it's always been position that we placed it. There's James. Read it. The picture was Donna. John. It's quite an amazing place. Jeff, come from Tasmania for this trip. You really feel that you're out there on the edge of the world. These pictures were taken in 1931. This is what Watkins Hut would have looked like then. Winter. This is a picture taken in 1967 from the Oxford University expedition. It's a similar picture, and it's looking up the river. Behind here is the actual lake, how Lakefield gets its name. And they use that lake for landing the gypsy moth or sea moths on. This is all that's left there now. The reason I got talked into going back this year was because I wanted to find one clue that's mentioned in the book. I'd never been able to find it. We'd found the hut, we'd found the cross, we'd resurrected the hut, we'd scavenged the remains of this hut for artifacts. And it was a tremendous trip. Really felt as if you were out there. Interesting to see the hut was a kit hut, all prefabricated and assembled on site. Going through all their rubbish that they'd left. Obviously, they weren't environmentally conscious in those days. Everything got tipped out, which is great for us now, I think, to go and explore, look around. I've got that tin opener at home, actually. I use it as a keyring from the shed. So here we were. We'd found a boat on previous trips. The remains of one of his boats that was on the beach. But on this occasion, I was looking for an inscription. It was the only clue that I hadn't found. And James, is here, reading the book, finding the description of this inscription. Now, James found it. We couldn't see it. We couldn't photograph it. The only way we could do that was to find some coal dust left over from their hut and fill the carving in with coal dust. So that was it. That was fantastic. It was the final thing for me to find this inscription that had been mentioned in the book. I don't have a reason to go back. Now, this was a sea moth that they used in the 30s to, they landed on the lake because it was an area that never froze in the summer, didn't have any ice in the summer. And in the winter, when it did freeze, it was really smooth. So that was interesting to go up and explore this. And then John found an old barrel, which would have been used to refuel that plane, sorry. So yeah, it was just fascinating. And we found this before. I'd found it on the beach and people said, no, it's modern boat. It's more recent than that. But then I found a picture from the 1967 Oxford expedition. Well, a video clip in actual fact. And if you pause the video at a certain place, you can see the remains of this different angle, but you see the remains of this boat. So this predates 1967. So it's the same type of boat, same design as Watkins would have used. And I'm fairly convinced that it's one of his boats. We've lifted it up now above the storm beach, so hopefully it'll be a bit more protected. Hopefully no one will think it's a handy bit of firewood when they go in. So it would have been a whaler, like a Shetland, classic Shetland boat. So this is what we'd have liked. This isn't a picture from this trip, but this is what we'd have liked. Good, healthy, 20, 30 miles of pack ice going out to sea, dampening down the swell, and then you're just bimbling along through the gaps in the ice. We didn't have that. We had absolutely flat calm, but very open seas. So we were a bit sort of, well, I was a bit anxious. We'd gone in there with the intention of spending a few days, but really we needed to cut and run and get out while the conditions were. So this was 4 o'clock in the evening. When we landed, we were just lucky. I'd forgotten how far the tide went out. And you can see it would have been a good mile of mud. And we were lucky. So we said, right, we'll have to leave at high tide. And this was 4 o'clock in the evening. We were looking at a 10-hour paddle to get back round the headland and to a suitable place to camp. So James is faffing a bit here. That's the normal. James. So there's Lakefield. There's the cross. We camped in here. Come round here. Across what's called Nugatusuk, which is very exposed to winds coming off the Greenland ice cap. And then we had to, this is called Hell's Corner in the book. And then we had to paddle along this coast, no landings. And we decided we would camp here, at a spot that we thought we could camp on. Anyway, so we're heading off. Probably 5 in the afternoon. Heading towards, we're crossing Nugatusuk, and this is what's called Hell's Corner. More great photos from Jeff Murray. Thanks, Jeff. This is Hell's Corner, mentioned in the book. Watkins had a few epics here, and Chapman had a few epics here over the years that they were out there. And this is a photo I found, which I don't think you guys saw. There's Hell's Corner. Yeah, I remember with Pete Jones seeing this as a cave and thinking we could paddle through it, but it's exactly, that's the rock. So it's a great shot. So this would have been a picture of them in the autumn, I guess, or the spring. Obviously, it's not winter time with them contemplating using boats, and it's obviously not summertime either. So, and I think this could well have been the boat that we found on that beach. But who knows? So just a few nice pictures. Late in the evening. And we got here, I think it took us about 8 hours to get around here, and starving, hungry, freezing cold. We did a cheese toasty, and then we were in bed, and we decided to have the next day off, because if you have a professional photographer with you, they always want to stop and take photos. Don't think that did you justice, Jeff. Doesn't do me justice. But that's a better one. So it's just amazing. Incredible place. Moving on down the coast a bit now. There's James. Looking back, there's Ailsa Craig, and we'd gone around this headland and beyond. This is great. This is the campsite down here. Over the years, I've watched this ice recede probably from this point. It's gone back a mile, half a mile maybe. That was an exaggeration. But it's a lot. This was lovely and warm. It's just a mountain pond, heating up all summer, so it wasn't at all cold. Someone has to take a photo, eh? So there we go. End of a trip. Bit of fishing. This is Arctic char. Really good eating. There's a few prime spots we know of now that it's good fishing. Locals depend on the fish, subsistence fishing. So this was a good end of trip supper. Arctic char and a few old new potatoes. This is a fish rack. It was a bit of a call it pink elephant. It never really took off. There was about 6 of those racks at one time in this area, with the idea of helping develop and promote fishing industry for the locals. But other than the locals being employed to build it, I don't think there was any benefit out of it at all. It was never really used. The economy in Greenland depends a lot on fishing. I think it's large companies now have bought the fishing rights. They fish, They don't land their fish in Greenland, they land them in Denmark. So that's a picture from Jeff. I can't take credit for that. So this is August. Oh, this was an interesting story. So we finished the trip, great trip, ticked all the boxes, got James there second time running, found that inscription, brilliant. Nice bunch of mates to go with, no reason ever to go back. So you have to go and celebrate. I've been out there all summer. I was sick to death of camping. And I said to James, how about a hotel, a cheap one? He goes, right, I'll let my son get on the case. So his son, fair play, looks as a hotel room. It's the honeymoon suite, top floor of this hotel in Iceland, Icelandair Hotel Reykjavik. So that was fine. It wasn't cheap, as you can see, 230 quid a night. But we thought, well, it's been a good trip. Anyway, it's a honeymoon suite, 2 double beds, fortunately. Don't know why you'd want 2 double beds in a honeymoon suite, really. But there were some nice fluffy towels. We made the most of that. Spruced ourselves up in preparation for the final expedition meal in a Indian restaurant, I think it was, swanky place. So that was the Watkins trip. Now, Paul, you'll have to tell me whether you want me to carry on here or answer questions. I don't hear anything, I'll just carry on. So after that original trip that I did with Pete Jones in 2002, we ended up
I think you're fine, Martin.
Yeah. So we ended up, me and Pete decided that we would do a trip because it had Watkins connections. We wanted to do a trip from Scoresby Sunter to Sealac. And this was down the Bluesville coast. It's about a 700-mile trip. It'd only ever been done once by a guy called Lonnie Dupree. And Lonnie, I do believe, well, I know for a fact, and I do believe it's cheating, he had a ride across here and started his trip at a place called Stewart Island, which is about a 2-day paddle from this point. But I'm not decrying his efforts in any way, shape or form. But we thought, right, we'll have a go at paddling from Scoresby Sunter to Sealac, 700 miles, unsupported because we didn't have any money to set up a fuel dump or anything like that. So originally we were going to do this trip, just me and Pete Jones, because we'd paddled a lot together. You need to know the person well. But fairly soon on, we realized we couldn't possibly carry the kit that we needed for a 700-mile, 65-day trip, which is what we worked out at. That's the maximum amount of time we had. So we decided that we'd have to get someone else along. So originally, Nigel Dennis said, right, okay, you can have a boat, you and Pete can have a boat. And then when we decided that we needed someone else, Pete managed to get Phil Clegg to join us, which was fantastic. I didn't know Phil at the time, but brilliant. And then for a little while, maybe only a day or two actually, there was some talk of, well, what are we going to do for another boat for Phil? And Pete says, oh, well, Mike Webb's making boats. And then as soon as that got mentioned, Nigel came up and said, oh, don't worry, chaps, I'll give you another boat. So Nigel came up trumps as usual, supplying people with boats to go and do amazing trips with. Unsung hero of this trip. Without Nigel, we wouldn't have been able to do this trip. Couldn't afford to buy boats. The thing was, Nigel said, right, well, you finish them off in the factory and then you can have them. So that was great. Phil and Pete put, I was living in Shetland then, so they put keel strips on and checked them all over, so that's good. And we actually had to ship the boats out. I got good sponsorship from Icelandair. They gave us free tickets. I got a company to ship the boats out from the UK to Greenland for us. Got someone to keep them over winter for us in Scoresby Sund, which is now called Itokotomi. So yeah, it was basically a free trip. It was quite a major trip, I thought, but fortunately other people did as well, so that was handy. So here we were. I'd been bodybuilding, as you can see, in preparation. Got got a very young Mr. Clegg here. There we are, sporting our sponsorship T-shirts. This is us flying into Scoresby Sund. Yeah, it wasn't great, to be honest. Too much ice. This was end of June, this was 2006. You land at a place called Constable Point. It's still called Constable Point, although Scoresby Sund now has been renamed since Greenland's become more and more self-governing. They changed the name to it. It's a great helicopter ride, though, from the airport to the little settlement, which gives you a bit of a view. This is what we were faced with. Didn't really envisage being able to paddle initially in this. When we'd sent the kayaks out, we'd sent out 65 days food for 3 people, 2 shotguns. No one actually knew about that. Ammunition, paddles, everything, basically, except what you can see. So the first night we bivvied out by this old hut, only to wake up in the morning to see guns poking out of the window up here. And they used it as a bit like a shooting hide, because they would be hunting seals and things off the beach here. So that was a bit amusing. So we scurry off to find our kayaks that have been in storage. They were all there, all the food was there, fine. And then start loading them. A lot of local interest. This lad came and helped us. Just everything else was laid out. Nothing went missing again, not even a chocolate bar. This is the local police station, the police car. It's quite interesting. The biggest crime as it was then, was shooting at the helicopter when they were drunk, as the helicopter flew in from we'd been warned about that. We'd also been warned not to camp because of the risk of polar bears. Under no circumstances were we to camp. That was kind of not too good news, having just arrived there to do our trip, and first night to be in bivvy bags anyway. So a lot of bears up in this area. Yeah, so there we are. Don't need to say anything about that. The houses look a bit scabby often on the outside because they're just sandblasted in the strong winds, either with hail and snow or gravel that gets whipped up in a summer storm. But inside, they were obviously really nice. They rely a lot on electric heating. Some nowadays have oil heating. This was kind of reminiscent of my kids, were probably not much older than this lad at the time. But everything, it's quite Spartan. And we got chatting to this guy whose name was Paul. He was a teacher in the school. And he was explaining that they order everything in, obviously, on the supply ship through what's the equivalent of an IKEA or a Argos catalogue. And when you translate the name of that catalogue, it comes out as The Wishing Book, which I thought was kind of appropriate. Yeah, so we set off. We were keen to get away from the village. We wanted to get down to headland where we would cross Scoresby Sund proper. My boat is obviously well overladen there. Wasn't that well packed. It didn't really get much better. Basically, the forward and day hatches are just full of food, just all shoved in, and then anything else you would take, clothing, sleeping bags, tents, etc., 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 is deck cargo. So we were all the same. So landing just to have a look at where we were going to go. This is lunch. It was quite good. If we took it in turns to dish out a day's food. So you would dish out breakfast, lunch, and evening meal, and then you wouldn't have to go into your boat again for 2 days until it was your turn again to dish out breakfast, lunch, and evening meal. So all you did was take your deck cargo off, and you never had to go in the hatches. So you looked forward to day 3 when you thought your boat would get a little bit lighter. Never seemed to. We didn't bother with cig bottles. Look, that's fuel. Phil even had a green jerry can you'd have for your flymo in front of his feet. I think Pete had one too. So it took us, I think, 2 or 3 attempts to cross Scoresby Sund. It was just too chocker with ice. Just couldn't do it. think we spent 9 days on this beach, waiting to cross Scoresby Sound. And in that period of 9 days, I think we had one attempt to cross. Still cooking. Phil was quite a good cook, much better than Pete. This was a polar bear just walked past our tent in the night, within what, 50 feet of the tent. We were all fast asleep inside, oblivious, fortunately. And this is where we were going. We had to cross this headland. Any information we had was pretty scant. We had no real tidal flow, currents, no idea. It was just basically basing it on what we'd experienced on similar headlands in different parts of the world, Scotland or whatever island I'd paddled around before. So you knew what to expect, but you didn't know for sure anything. So when we did cross here, I think it's about 30 miles. You can't land there. We didn't know that. We had another 2-hour paddle the other side of that before we could make a landing. So here we are, we're off. We must have got across at this point. Tend to paddle for an hour, stop for 5 minutes, paddle for an hour, stop for 5 minutes, chat. Opportunity to wrap. Boats were really wobbly with all that deck cargo, so you'd raft up so you could have a pee if need be. And also you'd rotate round. So the guy at the front would be looking for a route through the ice. That was his job. The guy in the middle was looking to the left for polar bears, and the guy at the back was looking to the right for polar bears swimming in the water. Really cold. We were conscious of saving fuel. So every time we'd land, we'd have set jobs. So I'd get a fire going, get some food on. The others would find water. He was always good at that. And then we'd start putting the tent up. Needed to do, so we just share jobs. But we'd light a fire whenever possible to keep our fuel reserves as good as we could. Mountain equipment came up trumps and gave us sleeping bags, so that was good. This is Phil's sleeping mat. He had a little tiny hole that he tried to fix with duct tape. This made it into the Kokatak catalogue, so that was quite good. They gave us suits and things. That was generous of them. Lots of support. So on the map that we had, it looked like, looking at the lay of the land, that we would actually be able to land. But of course, you find that it's actually like this. You can't land at all. The maps were interesting. Some were, there were no maps made for this area by the Danes. I managed to get maps via a contact and also with information from Lonnie Dupree. They were either American military restricted maps or Russian military restricted maps. No Danish maps at all. In fact, the Russian maps were much better. Phil's job was to, because Phil didn't have a gun, Phil had the camera. So his job was to make the film. He did a cracking job. I remember him borrowing and scrounging stuff off Justine, batteries and things and whatnot. We actually put together a pretty good video at the end of it. You can see the cameras we each had. Again, these were freebies, but they were only 2 megapixels. So kit in those days wasn't as good. Here, Pete's got a shotgun, sawn-off shotgun on the front deck. I had one. Phil had a nice axe. Oh, this was interesting. This boulder had started off up here, and it had come rattling down. I'd watched it, and it ended up in the sea. So even a beach like this, you'd think, well, we could land, but well, no, probably not a good idea. And there we are. It's quite interesting. Both Pete and Phil are looking up to the right, boulders whistling down the cliffs. So we made a decision to paddle a certain distance away because of the bouncing off the cliffs into the sea. Got a bit fed up of pasta, so we shot a ptarmigan or something. It was quite tasty. And these are turf houses. Again, we'd found they weren't on any maps. No one really knew about them. So that was quite interesting. Different style to the ones we'd seen in a Maslik area. Inevitably, there's a crypt, bones. I'm just going to whistle through some of these because there's quite a lot I'd like to share with you if interested. Getting out and having a look. The ice is moving all the time, so you've got to keep your boat, obviously. It did get rough. It wasn't like British rough or Shetland rough, but when you've got so much kit and the water's so cold, I'm not suggesting this is rough, but it did get rough during the trip, which was interesting because of the best will in the world, you get spread out quite a bit because your boats would surf at different rates and control differently. This is called, we're looking at Henry Land here. All these bits of coast have got really sort of romantic names. And Phil and I just got out to have a quick look to see if there was a way through this. But really, we thought once we crossed Scoresby, we thought we'd cracked it. It was all downhill psychologically. It was just a case of chipping away, keep going. You know, the big sort of crux for me was crossing Scoresby Sund, such a big crossing in that area. I found it quite scary, prospect of it. So we were on a roll here. Oh, this is interesting. I'd been a bit lazy, disorganized. I hadn't got any drinking water that morning, and I couldn't possibly ask these two to give me a swig of their bottle. So I saw this stream coming out of the hillside. I thought, right, below the rocks, I'm going to go and fill my water bottle up. So when I went up, it was hot. It was a hot spring. It was absolutely incredible. So hot you couldn't really strip off. It was just a case of washing your dry suit, but it was just amazing. One of the highlights of the trip in a funny sort of way. So we all had a good wash and a shave, but boy did we pay for it later when as soon as we got back on the water, soaking wet suits, freezing. We had planned on camping over on this headland somewhere over here around the corner, but there was nowhere to land. So you don't want to paddle into the fjord because that just is wasted time and effort. So you do another crossing, maybe a 3-hour crossing. Then hopefully there'll be some way to land on the next headland. You don't know till you get there. Yeah, so we crossed from over here, managed to land. And Carl Vissel was from Israel, was doing the weather for us. So he was emailing through to the satellite phone the weather, and we would send him our coordinates via the sat phone every day, and then he would send us a weather report. So we bivvied out. This was quite weird. Bivvying out, shotgun on a bag to keep it out of the gravel. Nowhere really to put the tent up sensibly. So just, so this is classic. This is like Phil's leading. Pete should be looking left for bears and I'm looking right for bears. We knew they were around. We'd seen every place we stopped to camp, there were bear tracks. It wasn't until almost halfway through the adventure that we saw our first bear. Nice big iceberg with Pete and Phil underneath it. Oh yeah, I'd been moaning that my boat was too heavy. I had too much kit. So I think we did a stock check here and got everything out, counted all the Mars bars, worked it all out. And then having made a fuss, I ended up being given another quite large dry bag. I apparently hadn't been carrying enough. This was interesting. We came around a headland. Tide was with us, but big back eddy. So we got scooshed out to sea a bit. Then all the water started disappearing because of the effect of the eddy pushing the ice in. So we clamber out as quick as we could. I remember in the excitement of it all, dragging my boat over my toe, which I'm pretty sure, or over my foot, which I'm pretty sure ended up breaking a toe. And we were originally over here, wanting to get down this coast. And we were just getting pushed further and further out to sea. So we stood there for, I don't know, hour, just watching. We were kind of going in the right direction, but also going out to sea. And then we thought, well, we'll just have to drag the boats across all this. Trouble is, dragging a boat, they capsize because the ice is uneven. So then we started tying them together to drag them. So they like a trimaran, so at least you could drag that. That meant the front guy jumping in and swimming, and it was a bit of a 2 and 8. Eventually we got here, very glad to get away from this lot onto dry, well, onto snow, not dry land. And then we got polar bear tracks again. We're here and here, and the polar bears going off there too. So it was my turn to get some food out. So that was good. Then the squalor of expedition camping. This was actually my favorite pan. It'd been all around Canada with me, and I was really fond of that pan. But if you cooked, you didn't wash up. So on this occasion, I remember Pete, and Phil will remember this, Pete washed up. So he goes down on one occasion to wash the pans. The wave comes in, sucks the pan out. And of course, he's not going to wade in to get a pan. So my favorite pan got lost. Anyway, here we go. This was interesting. So as you went down the coast, every 60, 100 miles, something like that, there'd be a hunter's cabin. These had been established from the sea, obviously, in the 30s. And I think this plaque basically says this territory is Denmark, claiming Greenland for Denmark. And they were always by a hut. We explored this hut on the way out, found a really good bear skull here, and got the bear jaw at home. Quite substantial, solid. Stuff doesn't rot out there, it just literally decays, but it doesn't rot like it would do in this country. So there was the hut. You can see the type of map we're paddling on. Not a huge amount of information on that. If you're trying to find campsites. This was good. This was 300 miles into the trip. We were looking into a coast that probably no one had ever landed on before, because the Scottish sealers that would have gone out there, Danish sealers, wouldn't have wanted to bring their fishing boats, sealing boats into such close proximity to the coast because of getting trapped there by the ice. Local Inuit Greenlandic people would not have gone into this area. It was uninhabited. There was no evidence of settlements here whatsoever. So we're 300 miles from where we'd come from. We were at least 300 miles from where we wanted to go. We were 300 miles from Iceland, and the west coast of Greenland was 300 miles across the Greenland ice cap. And I reckon pretty much we were the only people within that circle, bar possible ship out in the Denmark Straits. Amazing, really was an experience. Lots of conditions like this. Lots of conditions like this as well. Good mixture. Now this is getting towards the crux of the trip, the real crux of the trip. We ended up catching up the ice that comes down from the northern hemisphere down the east coast of Greenland. And we were just in a position where we were stuck. We couldn't go forwards or backwards, and we had to wait. And I think we waited long enough for Pete to firstly grow that stubble and then try and shave it off with a big razor, which I certainly wouldn't recommend. We were on this beach, if I remember rightly, for I think 13 days. Fortunately, because at this point we had full intentions of continuing, there was these 3 great big tree trunks on the beach, and Phil had grown up in Africa and he knew how to light a fire with the 3 corners coming together like the spokes of a wheel. And then you put your pot in the middle and that fire just keeps going. And it was a godsend because we didn't need any petrol. Fortunately, at the back of the campsite, there was this pond, fresh water, so snow melts, so we had plenty of water. These bear tracks were there when we arrived. We didn't see any bears, fortunately, during our 2-week visit, nearly 2 weeks. But at the back, I don't think I've got a photo of it, but at the back of the beach, there was this huge big cliff, and come about 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock in the morning, once the sun had got on the cliff, it would just drop off rocks that would come whistling down and bounce and ping out. And I remember some days snoozing in the tent because there was nothing else to do, and you'd hear this stone come, and you just think, you'd automatically just curl up into a little ball to reduce the chance of it hitting you, which was daft really, but there we are. You can see the tent, and there's this cliff here. So it was quite a atmospheric place, and there was no way we could get out in that ice realistically and get anywhere sufficiently that we would be safe and be able to get to land again unless that ice cleared out. And if you started dragging your boat over this, it would just, they were so heavy, you would just break the back of your boat, and then you would be in the shit. So that's the view. But this is quite slushy, it's quite thick. You know, that's the size of a football field potentially. And then these lumps are the size of, you know, dinner tables and things. So you weren't pushing those out the way. There's no way we could make progress. So there we sat for 2 weeks. Got so bored you'd start taking photos of yourself. And the view from the tent was pretty spectacular, but not what we wanted. So it gets to the point where you think, right, we're going to have a go at crossing this. So we set off, packed up, set off. I remember getting to this piece of ice, and we got out and we stood there and we stood in silence for quite a while. No one wanting to say anything, the inevitable. But it was obvious that we weren't going anywhere. We'd be lucky if we could get back at that point, we thought. Anyway, while we've been stood there, the ice that my boat had been tied to, I think Phil's boat, had drifted off. So Phil was just a young whippersnapper in those days, and he was either over enthusiastic or easily persuaded, and to rescue the kit. Thanks, Phil. So we were down here, Cape Vidal. I think that was the cape we were trying to get. That was the cape we were trying to get to. We were at Grivel Bight here on the beach. We had to then paddle back, which was okay because we knew campsites, or the few campsites that there were, we knew where they were. But of course, it meant in my head, I thought, oh, for Christ's sake, we've got to cross this again. And this was just the worst prospect in my mind. So we headed back. And then the very day we decided to head back, it was almost like a reward for making the right decision. We saw this polar bear here in this pond. We were having to go hop from pond to pond. And I guess he was doing the same. And there he is again. You could just see his snout. In fact, I saw him first because we decided we were going to shoot a duck. There's lots of, what do they call them? Big ducks. Something, all I know. You'll all know. It'll come to me. So we decided we would shoot this big duck for tea. So I'm looking for a duck, and I see this thing look like a football drifting off in the wrong direction to the flow. And I thought it was a duck. Eider duck, that's it. And it turned out to be the snout. So anyway, we passed him okay without any incident, fortunately. Bit of early schoolboy type giggling going on, but we soon left him. We got back to this hut because we thought, great, we'll burn some of this wood, etc., and we can camp here. We'd seen the hut previously. And anyway, as we were unpacking, getting ready to set up camp, the bear walks towards us. We'd actually seen the bear, all three of us had seen the bear over here, and it looked like a piece of white plastic just blowing in the wind. But we realized afterwards he was like a dog scratching his back leg, using his back leg to scratch his chin. Of course, as soon as he smelt us, he starts wandering over. And he investigates where I'd been to the toilet first. And then he wanders closer and closer. And he actually came right up to the hut. We've got a good video of it. I didn't take any, I was too busy nursing the shotgun. But Phil got some good video footage of it. and he came right up to the hut, at which point the three of us were stood on the roof of the hut, like the Alamo. But he just sniffed and sniffed and sniffed, and then he ran off, almost like Pete said there was a bigger one behind us that we weren't aware of, that he was running away from. So Pete was out collecting water, found this narwhal tooth, and we found the boy, and we reckon the narwhal had been probably hunted further north at Itokatomi, drifted away and got lost by the hunters, and then this was one of the few beaches it would have washed ashore at. So he extracted the tooth, which was good. He managed to get it home. Actually, we got it home. He ended up on eBay and paid his expenses, having given up work for 3 months to do this trip. Probably not too clever to launch such overloaded boats off seal launch them in. Sometimes you have to do these things. No need to really, but hey ho. Pete lightening his boat again. And then we're shooting ducks to get a bit of variety to our pasta. It did get a bit rough. Of course, there was no ice at this point to dampen down any swell. So we had quite a few rocky landings. Amazing how the boats held up to it. You know, they were really full, much fuller than you'd use on a general expedition. And we were not able to treat them at all responsibly, I guess. So even where there's supposed to be a beach to land on, even at the end of the trip, the winter snow was still there. I like this picture because Phil's got very nice teeth. I do admire his teeth, so I like that photo. This is crossing now back to from the name of it off the top of my head. So we're crossing north, crossing Scoresby again, heading back to Scoresby Sund, or Dokatami as it's called now. The trouble is it was hazy. There's a lot of magnetic variation in your compass. We didn't actually know what to head for. There was no distinct headland like there had been on the way south when we'd come south. So basically we just sort of headed off, paddle for an hour, rest for an hour for 5 minutes, sorry. So every hour you'd have a 5-minute break, try and stay together. So this is leaving one headland, heading across to the next one. About halfway across, I think this was it, the fog cleared a bit. Still not quite too sure where we were going, as far right as possible, I seem to think. And eventually we made it, 8 hours or something, not a lot of pleasure in that. But of course, then we'd supposed to have been finishing in Tasiilaq, and our return flights were from Tasiilaq. So we then had to speak to our sponsor and arrange for them to get new tickets for us to fly back from Constable Point to Iceland. Phil's teeth again. He'd lost a bit of weight. Wish I'd lost as much as him, but there we go. Young Clegg. To celebrate our safe crossing of Scoresby Sund a second time, Pete took a very rash decision to wash his underpants in hot water using my spare pan. Must say I made my coffee first, obviously, but there we are. That was Pete's celebration. Clean pants. Now this will be a quick one. Last 5 minutes, as Tom says, is always the best. So this is the same trip, but it was a film trip I did. I got invited out to work with a film crew that were making a film of which the presenter was a guy called Steve Backshaw. And the plan was to paddle up here and into this area to do some filming. I went along as a safety kayaker for Steve and the other two guys, the other two people who were the paddlers, the stars of the show. I was just there as safety. So anyway, that was the plan. So we flew into the same airport. And I'd got tasked to procure all the equipment, paddling equipment. So the obvious choice was Nigel's HV Explorers. So this is Nick and Alistair. They got them from the factory, took them to Immingham for shipping to Iceland. And then I'd got all the kit, reed, shield sheet, various Lendl paddles, all the other kit we needed, got shoved in the boats. And then we flew out. They got shipped out in advance. We flew out, met up in Iceland. This is the hand luggage of the film crew. I actually thought I was going on an expedition which was being filmed. As in actual fact, it turned out we were making a film of an expedition, which is different. So obviously I was looking at conditions, giving people advice on what it was like. I don't know why these red lines are on there. I can't get rid of them. But this is what it looked like. And of course, their plan was to paddle up here. I had pointed out it was a bit early. They only had an opportunity to film at a certain time. So here we are flying in. It's pretty cool, actually. I'd never been in a twin otter. And obviously, I've been to this area before, which is why I probably got the gig to go back to do this. But it was great to go back and see areas that Phil and Pete and I had traversed. This is Stewart Island, guys. I'm sure if either of you are online, Phil might be. And just to see the coast that we'd paddled years before. This is Tangent. Paul Walker has a company called Tangent Expeditions. Some of you will know Paul. He has this permanent base out at the airport of what's it called? Constable Point. That's it. So it's quite impressive. And so this is where we flew into. Now this was interesting because the pilot of the Twin Otter wasn't sure if the Explorers would fit in, and I was envisaging. I got repair kits, and I thought, well, if it comes to it, we can cut 6 inches off the bow and 6 inches off the stern, pack them up with some plastic padding type stuff, and we'll be good to go. In actual fact, I think they must have measured everything a dozen times, and they just fitted in perfect. So I think this flight cost 10 grand to get this kit out there. They arrived pretty much unscathed. General, fair bit of faffing about, to be honest, about how we were going to do stuff. It was pretty new for these guys and me, which is why it was an interesting project to be involved in, as to how we were going to fly all this kit out and just do the logistics. So I'm in an iron and faffing here as to how we're going to get the kayaks, obviously, from the airport to the settlement. So this is the final solution, obviously. I always make out to the kids that flew the helicopter, but obviously didn't. This is flying in. This is the settlement of Itokatormi. Very similar conditions, in fact, to when Phil and Pete and I were there a decade earlier. Oh, a bit more ice. This is in June, beginning of June. You can see there's dog sled tracks there. They've only just come off the ice with the dogs. And here we are. These are Nigel's 4 Explorers coming in as a sling load, which is pretty cool. I think these boats had come from factory in Holyhead and were now up here. Quite a bit of snow in the winter, lamppost there. And every day in Greenland is an ice cream day. Faffing. obligatory kids trampoline, even this far north. Washing on the line, even though it's below freezing. And this is the most northerly in Greenland anyway, the most northerly all-weather football pitch. When they mean all-weather, they mean all-weather. Plenty of evidence of polar bears. And this is, where we're going kayaking. To be fair, when we flew in, it was much more open than this. As we were there for a few days faffing around, these big rafts of ice just drifted in and blocked everything. So that was quite good for me because it meant I had to go with a guy called Stu, who was a cameraman, and he was trying to film polar bears. So we went right down past where Phil and Pete and I had camped on our previous trip to the settlement at the end there, and we were trying to film polar bears. And I went basically just as the gunman for him, for protection. We saw polar bear tracks. We didn't, on this occasion, didn't see polar bears. And while we were doing that, everyone else was faffing. There's a drone being tested. Eventually we got off, just in absolute desperation that, well, we've come all this way, we've spent this money, we've got to make a film, so we've got to get some shots of people kayaking. And this was just literally in the harbour. Yeah. It's pretty chock-a-block. And nice to be on the water. This guy was a character. I asked him at one point, I'll tell you that story in a minute. So the helicopter was in quite a lot of use, running fuel round for the boats. We had 2 hunters' boats and a support boat from the company, which Matt was driving. So we needed a lot of fuel. Nice picture of some geese. So yeah, just a few pictures. I'd ended up, for some reason, I wasn't really wanting to be in all of the footage, but for continuity, because they'd filmed me once or twice in key places, I ended up having to be in all the shots, pretty much all of them, which was quite cold when you're sitting around waiting for things to happen. When you're used to just cracking on. Yeah, same guy. He was a real character, local Inuit hunter, local guy. He had an oppo with him running another boat. We couldn't communicate. We didn't speak the same language, but you could communicate, sign language and sort of gestures. And now this was funny. I'm a great believer in these stoves, and I knew it'd be cold, so I wanted one to basically be organised, have my own routine, my own setup in the tent like I do when I'm in Greenland anyway. And everyone else was having to use MSR stoves outside in the cold. And but this was great. I could have it on in the tent, central heating, and brews and stuff like that. So this is called James Land, this bit of coast that runs north, up the north side, north and northwest of Scoresby Sund itself. It's not an inspiring place to paddle. The only interesting thing is looking across to the far side, to the start of the Bluesville coast on the left and the south side of Scoresby Sund we're looking at there. Otherwise, it's just like a huge, long, sandy beach and with tundra and not particularly inspiring inland vistas as you paddle down on your right. But on this occasion, they got the footage they were after. Polar bear moseyed on, excuse me, I got hiccups. Polar bear moseyed on down the beach, sniffing, sniffing, sniffing. He was obviously quite interested. I wasn't at all anxious, like I would have been if I'd have been guiding a trip in Tasiilaq, because we had 2 hunters with us who were obviously experienced hunters. We had other people with guns, and I had a pump-action sawn-off shotgun on my kayak as well. So basically I could just quite comfortably stand at the back of the crowd and take photos. And this bear this is with a big lens obviously, but the bear came close. He ended up very close. I'm sure if we'd have ignored him, left him alone, not really done much, he'd have come and investigated and then wandered off. But didn't really quite transpire like that. He ended up coming close, and he ended up being forced towards the water because there's a lot of people trying to scare him away from us rather than ignoring him. And he didn't want to go in the water because it was cold and he dried out. So he was trying to work out a way of passing us. He wasn't trying to attack us, he was trying to get past us. But that didn't happen. And eventually he was persuaded to leave because the most humane thing to do was just to throw stones at him. And he got fed up with that, 10 people throwing stones at him. And he ended up going into the sea and swimming off. Well, I asked this guy here, oh, how close would you let the bear get to you before you shot it? And he put his finger on my arm, poked me and said, that close. Slight exaggeration, I'm sure. And then I said, well, how many bullets would it take to kill it? And he goes, half. He got his finger and made a little gesture of half. So these guys knew what they were doing. We weren't in any danger. This is the bear swimming off. Tremendous bear. It was really good to see it. So that's just a picture of me. It was cold. I must say it was really cold. I've never been as cold paddling in life. Partly because we were going quite slow. Because everything had to be filmed. Film crew were great. I'd never been on a trip with a diesel generator though. So obviously they had to download all their footage, needed all the power. So that was running all night. But you can see it's not a fantastic bit of coast. I wouldn't recommend anybody goes kayaking along James Land. There's much better places you could go to if you went further inland. So this was the end of our trip. I think we'd paddled about 60 miles tops. Like a 3-day paddle. So that phase was over. I ended up going with Stewie then later on we were filming muskox, and right behind, I just went to the toilet right behind the camp and saw these muskox, came back and said, hey, that's what you need to go and film. So we did that. That was pretty cool. I'd never seen these before. You don't get them into Sea Lac. They're actually a goat, member of the goat family. And they're hunted. There's a quota for them, but they're hunted throughout Greenland. And in fact, people from Tasiilaq will fly up to Itokotomi so they can hunt them because the meat's obviously important. So lots of helicopters, lots of sling loads, lots of faffing about, but tremendous. You know, buzzing around in helicopters most days and getting views like this from the helicopter. It really was great. And then we'd set up some fuel dumps because we were traveling so far by helicopter that we needed to set up dumps and then landing in at some of the abandoned settlements and things like that we were able to visit, that you would, not settlements, weather stations. Right, this is the last one, Paul, promise. This is really quite an interesting story. This lady is called Sarah Spencer Chapman, and I don't have much to do with clubs. Probably would with your club, but generally I don't like clubs. I'm sure it'd be different in your club. But I was at our local club in Shetland at the swimming pool for pool nights, and I was running a session looking for some people to join my little pod of people, trying to find people that were hesitant, that needed a bit of proper encouragement. Anyway, I'm stood there in my budgie smugglers. This lady stood there feeling a bit self-conscious. I'm sure she won't mind me saying. We got chatting. And anyway, and I didn't mention Greenland once. Anyway, it transpires that this lady is the daughter-in-law of Freddie Spencer Chapman, who was Gino Watkins' Oppo on both of his Greenland expeditions. So some of you know me well enough to think, right, Clogstar cogs start clicking. This is Stephen Spencer Chapman. He's in the military. And I thought, right, there's an opportunity here to do a Chapman expedition to Greenland, to get these guys out there to visit both sites and make a film. And the intention was to get Stephen out on a trip to the original base camp, the 1930-31 base camp. Other members of the trip were James on the left, who'd come from America on many trips with me, and Sonia on the right, who'd been helping me on some trips that year and the year before. So the plan was to go south to the base camp that Watkins had down here in the 30s. Unfortunately, as it got closer to the time, work commitments for Stephen being in the forces prevented him from coming. But anyway, it was all planned, so the four of us went. So this is paddling to a hut at a place called Natavi, which is where the trip would start properly, because that was new ground for us all. So, yeah, we knew this area well. The hut at Natavi is just in here. And on that night, we'd seen a polar bear up here a few days earlier, which was the first time I'd seen a polar bear in this area with my groups. So we were quite pleased at the prospect of getting to this hut. We didn't know what it looked like, but I had a good contact who told me about it, because it meant we wouldn't have to do a bear watch. We could get in there and just shut the door and we'd be fine. So we unload here. On trip, you either need Jimsky or James. Jimsky's good at lighting fires. James is good at clearing out huts. And this hut was absolutely minging. It had a horrible foamy pad thing that people have been sleeping on for decades. Anyway, James disposed of that. He set fire to it, to be honest, which at the time seemed a good idea. Within about 30 seconds, it seemed a horrendous idea. And after the event, about an hour later, it was just a bit of a relief that we hadn't had any helicopters fly in to rescue us, because, well, it was a huge black pool of smoke that went up, and I wouldn't have done it if I'd have known. But anyway, so here's the hut, pretty cool. Boats on the rocks, fantastic. No ice. We were heading into the field. This was really interesting. I'm convinced that these are upright posts set up by the locals in the 30s and before then for their rope gymnastics. I don't think rope gymnastics are just a modern day thing. I think they would have been utilized throughout the winter for agility training for kayaking. And these were perfectly positioned, perfectly secured, buried for that activity. Now, this is the remains of a house at Natavi, and I'm also convinced that this is reclaimed wood from Watkins' hut, his base camp that was abandoned in 1930, yeah, 1931. They just left it, walked out, shut the door and left it. It was in the wrong place for the locals, this bit settlement. So they wouldn't have just let it go. They'd have taken it down and repurposed the wood. So here we are paddling in. I'd actually been in here before. The other three hadn't. I was particularly keen to get Donna in there. She's a great grandmother. She was the first woman ever to paddle in and out of Lakefield, and the oldest person to ever go in and out of Lakefield. So to get her in here too, well, to say to get her, nothing that I did, she got herself in there and out. But for her to come in here with me was just, it was great. And the paddle in was really good. We were all pretty excited. I sort of remembered roughly where we were headed. We wanted to go to exactly the same slabs that Watkins had used when he unloaded the Quest at the start of his expedition. We'd run out of water at Natavi. When we got there, we thought there'd be water. There wasn't. So we had a night just eking out what we had. So we filled up with water at first opportunity. This was another good use of my laminated mat to make a funnel to fill up my water bladder. What you can't see is we stood up to our knees in bog there, Smagnum bog. So here we are, we'd come in, we'd landed at these rocks, fantastic smooth rocks. And these are famous from all of the Watkins books because they unloaded all their boats there. And we were particularly interested to take photos and compare the ice now as to what it was like in the 30s. So this is the Quest when it came in. This was actually a boat used by Shackleton when he went down to South Georgia, and he died on this boat, or he was on this boat and on South Georgia when he died in South Georgia. So the boat had a huge history. Now, if you look at the ice at the back there, coming right down to the sea, and see how it's changed. You know, it's incredible the difference between 1930s and now. So basically what we wanted to do, see, all this would have been ice. That's obviously an island there, but all these bits of rock showing through were the Greenland ice cap coming right down. So what we wanted to do was to find as many opportunities to replicate photos from the early books as we could. So we dug out all these pictures of the huts and their sort of living and stuff like that. And this is the hut, this is the base. This is all that's left of it, the foundations. It's just amazing to get in there, and we spent, I think, 5 days in there just pottering around, taking photos, exploring, finding out where they'd done these shots. And it was interesting. This is obviously been set up because when you realize where they took it from, all the pictures that they took were staged. And it's not surprising when you looked at the bulky cameras they had, but they were all set up for the camera, all the shots. But we were comparing the background, all these green grassy bits, with how it is now. So it was very easy to see that they'd set their camera up here where James is stood, and they were doing their rescue rolly thing just out past where Donna is. But still, it was understandable, and it was nonetheless very impressive. And to stand there and think, right, well, that's where they took the photo, and that's where the crew were out here. It just made you think. You did feel very remote out here. We weren't actually that far from civilization compared to other trips I've done. So you did feel away from it all. This rock here was quite significant to me. It's a very noticeable triangular rock there. And it's there, look, there I am. And unless you're obsessed by all of this nonsense like I am, my ramblings probably won't strike a chord with you. But to be able to stand there and sit on that rock and see that picture of that moth that they used to land in there, and stand on the rock here, knowing that Watkins had just been off there posing for the camera, was quite special, really. Another view, that's the remains of it's all that's left of the hut. So I'm convinced the locals took it down and repurposed it. We found this. This was a, what do you call it? It's a ring off one of the radio masts. And obviously, yeah, broken bottles, junk, spent bullet cases, all sorts of crap. This was interesting. This is their washing line, and the post there holding up the washing line. And then Donna finds the post, exactly the same place. Obviously, definitely the same post as was there in 1930 holding up their washing line. So it was just like reliving the history, really, knowing that no one else had really gone in with our sort of obsession and noted this stuff and been intrigued by it. Remains of the old potbelly stove. This is a diode from a Seagull engine. Seemed to make sense at the time. Shoe leather. James said that it was the only place he'd ever been where you went to the toilet with your camera and a rifle at the same time. The camera for the icebergs rolling over and the rifle for polar bears. So we wanted to go and explore what's called Bugbear or Buggery Bank, as it was probably really known, which is how Watkins' team accessed the ice cap in the 30s, which meant paddling over to the far side. We had a day's outing to explore up here. There we are on our way. When we got there, we landed and we mooched about a bit, but you know, we only came around the corner a bit, but you could tell that the ice had receded so far back in 90 years that that was not going to be a realistic option for us to be hiking up there to try and get onto the Greenland ice cap. So this is just a picture of the campsite. So you can see all this would have been ice at one time, but it's gone, it's receded. That's just a view from the top of the hill. So anyway, we had another day trip from our camp. So we paddled across to another vantage point where we thought we could land, excuse me, and access the ice cap. It was just, in mountaineering terms, we didn't really achieve anything, but it was just cool to be on the Greenland ice cap at Watkins base camp, and to plodge around and get a different aspect of it all. As I say, nothing technical, nothing particularly adventurous about it, but it just added to the occasion, added to the memory of it all, and gave you that little bit more connection with these other guys. So one of the things we'd been tasked to do was, obviously, originally Stephen Spencer Chapman was going to come out with us. We still hope Sarah and Stephen will come out at some point and visit both base camps with me, perhaps not kayaking, but by other means. But one of the things we did was placed a plaque on behalf of the Spencer Chapman family, acknowledging all the team members of that expedition, because there's nothing there at all to acknowledge that. So there's the plaque. Here was the book. This is a fantastic read if you get a chance. It's called Northern Lights, and it was the official book written by Freddie Spencer Chapman about that Watkins expedition, which was all, I didn't mention that, you'll have to read that yourself. That was all to do research into transatlantic air route expeditions for Pan Am Airlines. That's another whole talk. So ironically, on the last day, it wasn't the last day actually, we'd seen several of these high altitude jets flying across to the States, which is what Watkins was all about doing, researching for this sort of event eventually. It was so high you couldn't see it. So that was appropriate that that was there. And then because it was called the Northern Lights, on the last night before we left, to actually get Northern Lights like this in end of August was pretty impressive. So I'm just going to take another minute of your time, if there's anybody left out there, because one of the things that's talked about an awful lot in the books are the records and the parties they had with the local girls in their hut. And without going into any details, several of the expedition members fathered children with local girls back in the 30s. So this, I was just so made up. James found this, and then we found several bits ourselves. This is old gramophone record from the hut, from their expedition. And I just found it amazing. So I've got some big bits, and I've still got it with a specialist, and we're trying to find out exactly what record it was that they were playing at the time. But you imagine being in that hut in the winter, in those conditions they were in, and it you know, listening to that music, it's just amazing. So I don't know if this will work, but we'll give it a go. Very faffed around with that, I must admit. I don't think it probably worked too well. Cheers, guys, for listening.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing, Martin. Incredible. Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid to ask me to talk about Greenland in an hour is impossible.
Martin, would you like to unshare your screen so you can see people?
Yeah. That's that.
That's it. Perfect.
Oh. Yeah, so
That was absolutely wonderful, Martin. And obviously that what links it through is that great emotion. I mean, it might be paddling, it might be environment, but the feeling really came through in that talk, which was wonderful. Thank you very much to everybody to join in that.
Yeah.
well, that's good. At least you're there, Fern, still. That's good to see you.
Does anybody have any questions for Martin?
No one there now, Tom.
Silence. I've got one if I can ask it.
Certainly, James, go away.
Hang on a minute. Hang on.
Let's go back.
And Greg Miller, sorry.
When are we going back?
Oh, yeah. Well, as soon as COVID allows. Yeah, you're on the you're penned in, Jim. Don't worry.
Any more?
A quick question from me, Martin. A fascinating talk. Thanks very much. Really, really interesting and very scenic. What I noticed was there didn't seem to be many caves. Can you say anything about the geology in that respect?
There are no caves. No, that's as much as I know. It's because the ice in the winter obviously scours the cliffs. What you do get is very smooth, fantastically smooth, polished rock that on a calm day you're just drawn to as much as the ice. Well, I am now, and you're just paddling along, running your hand along this lovely, warm, smooth, polished rock. So it tends to be like that, or your general sort of cliffy, jumbly, broken up rock that you'd get in Scotland or anywhere else. You know what I mean? But no, it's not the sort of area you'd get caves.
So, Martin, for me, one of the big bits of that was the trip you did with Phil and Pete.
Yeah.
Scoresby son, which just really amazed me. And I remember Phil wrote an article in Canoe Focus about it a long time ago, where he said, I went around an ice floe and startled a polar bear, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And that relationship with the bears and the wildlife, and to be out there seeing the tracks all the day, how did that make you feel?
Well, initially we were quite anxious that we would see a bear, we didn't want to see one. You know, we always had this joke that you want to see it running off in the distance and heading the other way. I think within the first few days of camping and having the bear walk up behind our tent so close led us into like a false sense of security that, well, they weren't really that interested in us and they weren't going to bother us. We didn't know any better. You know, you read all this stuff, but you don't know. And then because everywhere we landed, there were bear tracks, either in the gravel or on the snow, we still hadn't seen a bear. So we thought, well, there's obviously bears around, but they're keeping away from us, really, sort of thing. But no, when we saw one in the water, I suppose, to be honest, we were shitting ourselves that this bear could come and get us if it wanted. But he was inquisitive, he sniffed, and you strongly felt that they had the sort of the nous, the knowledge that to sort of associate us as something they weren't familiar with, they didn't know, and therefore they should avoid us. You know what I mean? And then every bear we saw, I think we saw 3 or 4 other bears after that one in the water, and they all just came. They were inquisitive, and then they left. And we didn't have to fire warning shots at them. We did in the water because we were a bit spooked by that. But once we were on dry land, we thought, well, we'll let them get closer so we can get some better footage. No, it was an amazing. It's probably the most amazing thing in my life is that sort of close contact with polar bears, because I've seen obviously more on that film shoot, and then recently in Tasiilaq on a trip that Nick and James were on with me. Yeah, it's special.
And that humpback, Martin.
Yeah, humpbacks are incredible. The whales you get out there. I know everyone can see whales in this country, and in Shetland there's a lot at the moment, but to see them in Greenland in that environment, it just seems aesthetically to be the right place. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, especially that sleeping one that swam underneath us. That was pretty good. Yeah.
No, it's brilliant, isn't it? And you've been out a few times with me now. You'll have seen.
Yeah, I came out a couple of times. Thank you, Martin. Yeah, it's still hooked deep into my soul.
Yeah, it gets you. I think you.
It does.
If you perhaps go once and think, well, it's not for me, or you're addicted. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Could I just ask about the weather conditions, Martin? So July, August, is it warm and dry enough to get your kit dry when you camp at the end of the day, or do you find you're kind of damp throughout the expedition?
No, it's a very dry atmosphere, I find, and if you do get wet, you dry very quickly. If you that's on the proviso that the high pressure system is on the Greenland ice cap, because you can get very still, settled weather on the east coast if there's high pressure on the ice cap. But we've had trips where it's chucked it down with rain for a few days before it brightened up. But generally speaking, I go to Greenland for good weather, so I get a good suntan from my wrists to the end of my fingers and from my neck to the top of my head, because you're obviously in a dry suit. But the bit that's exposed, hi Rosie, the bit that's exposed is you get a good tan on that. And if you've got a breathable dry suit on, then you're not going to really get too sweaty if you're layering properly. And there's not a lot. I tend to live in the same clothes. I'll paddle in the same clothes, take my dry suit off, air that around, well, turn that inside out and air it out. And then as I'm wandering around camp in my smellies, they get aired out, and you end up sleeping in them anyway. So I don't really change clothes every day. I take spare clothes, but if I have to take it out of my dry bag in the bow of my kayak, then there's something gone wrong.
Okay. Any more serious questions from people? Okay, I'll ask another one.
Don't feel you have to, Tom, if no one wants to.
I do feel I have to. You obviously count Jimsky's jokes.
Yeah, he's got 37.
37. That was the answer I wanted. It's the most important question we could ask. So maybe we should get a list of them.
Yeah, well, I'll send you a list.
Thank you very much, Martin.
I've heard them all about 5 times.
Yes. And with the same facial expressions, no doubt. I've heard them all, but I was drinking at the time.
Yeah. I think they're much better. As long as you're drinking, they're much better.
Yeah. Okay, so anybody, anything else to say before we call this a night?
That's very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Sorry it went on. Sorry it went on so long.
Oh no, lovely.
We're not.
Very, very enjoyable.
Yeah.
Good insight.
Yeah, well, those who haven't been don't need to go now because you've seen the pictures.
We get a refund.
It's a bit
I'm sure
warm.
it whets everybody's appetite to go again. And I know that the people doing our tour next month, Craig and Stuart, are two of Martin's favourite people. And I'm sure he'll be joining us then for that. And good wishes. Have a good festive season when we've been allowed off the leash. And we'd hope to see as many of you as possible in January. And many thanks to you for taking part tonight. Really does. This sense of community that we get from doing these things means a lot to me and hopefully to everybody else. So thank you all very much.
Nice one, Tom. Thanks very much. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Hey, Martin, that was good.
Martin.
Bye, Rosie.
Bye, bye, Nick.